This committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 5 bipartisan measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record and extraneous material on any of today's business. As all were notified yesterday, we intend to consider these measures en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided to members will be considered en bloc. They're considered as read. H.R. 1654, to authorize the direct provision of defense articles and services to the Kurdistan Regional Government. Royce Amendment 87 in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 3654, the Combat Terrorist Use of Social Media Act, Poe Amendment 81 in the nature of a substitute, and ISA Amendment 56. H.R. 4154, the Taiwan Naval Support Act, House Resolution 346, condemning the use of toxic chemicals as weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic, Yoho Amendment 72 in the nature of a substitute, House Resolution 536, supporting freedom of the press in Latin America, and Series Amendment 13 in the nature of a substitute. And after recognizing myself and the ranking member, I'll be pleased to recognize any members seeking recognition to speak on these measures. So we go first to H.R. 1654. This goes to the issue of the effort by Kurdish forces. We heard testimony in the House. Secretary of Defense Carter and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, both stated that they would be prepared to recommend providing direct military assistance to the Kurds and Sunni tribes. I would point out to the members that the Peshmerga is organized under the Iraqi Constitution. Their role is to safeguard Iraqi Kurdistan, and in particular, the Kurds are the sole U.S. allied force operating on the ground against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and this has allowed them to conduct ongoing coordinated offensive operations in northeastern Syria and in Sinjar, Iraq. This offensive, if they're successful ultimately, could sever control of the road connecting the major ISIS-held cities of Raqqa and Mosul in Syria and Iraq. So it is very much in our interest to make certain, especially given the significant territory and the some 8 million people under that territory that's controlled by ISIS, that ISIS do not have the safe haven that they used to plan the attacks in Paris and that, frankly, inspired the attacks on the United States. And to keep America safe, I believe we've got to work with our partners on the ground to eliminate these sanctuaries and deny ISIS both the space and resources to drive additional attacks. For the last year and a half, we've had one effective fighter in this fight. It is the 160,000-strong Peshmerga force. 30% of these battalions, by the way, are women fighting on the battlefields in their own battalions on the front lines against ISIS on a 650-mile front. They have proven themselves as the most dedicated and effective force against ISIS in Iraq. Not without considerable casualties, by the way. 8,500 killed and wounded on those front lines, and we're told by our friends in the Pentagon, a lot of those losses are caused by the fact that they're outmatched in firepower in terms of the weaponry on the front lines. They are poorly armed, poorly equipped, especially when compared to either the Iraqi army or the Iranian-backed Shia militias, or most crucially here, ISIS itself. Light arms from Saddam's rule, some of their material dates back to the Second World War, a lot of it's Soviet-era equipment that will break down. This isn't enough against an enemy that is determined to rip Iraq and Syria apart, butchering Iraqis and Syrians and now Americans. And so the Iraqi military remains unable to field a joint Sunni-Shiite force. We hope they're able to do so in the future. But at this moment, They're relying instead on Iranian-backed militias to fight ISIS. On the other hand, the Kurds in northern Iraq are our best allies in the theater, the most effective local fighters against ISIS, and rather than fleeing from ISIS, they stand to fight with antiquated weapons as they continue to share with us. Last month, it was the Kurdish forces on the ground and the Americans in the air that retook Sinjar. The Kurdish forces have accompanied U.S. Special Forces on night raids, a role that will likely increase given Defense Secretary Carter's announcement last week. They would like to get those night vision goggles, by the way. So this legislation would allow the United States to directly arm Kurdish forces so that they can get the artillery, the anti-tank weapons, the long-range mortars, and the training and combat medicine that they need. This authorization, which is time-limited, would allow U.S. security assistance to go directly to the Kurdish regional government rather than routing it through the sectarian maze that is Baghdad, where they've yet to get the kind of heavy equipment that they need in this fight. The goal, obviously, is not Kurdish independence, and we make that clear in the language of this legislation. But it is to get the needed materials to the most active battlefront with ISIS. And this is urgent legislation to counter the grave and direct threats ISIS poses to the United States, and ultimately is going to require the combined efforts of all Iraqis, including the Sunni tribesmen, who have not gotten the support they desperately need from the United States. We met with them last week with some of their leadership, tribal leadership. And certainly it's going to require Baghdad to be inclusive here to finally defeat and destroy ISIS. Second, we have H.R. 3654, the Combat Terrorist Use of Social Media Act of 2015, and I appreciate Judge Poe introducing this bill. It's going to force and put the heat on the administration to put forward a strategy to combat terrorists' use of social media, a strategy that the President talked about in 2011, but we haven't had that strategy put forward yet, so this is Congress weighing in and saying, let's have that strategy developed, because exactly 1 week ago in San Bernardino, California, we had 14 people killed, 21 people injured by radical Islamists, and we know that these extremists, the husband and the wife, use social media, one of them making a pledge on Facebook to support ISIS. Extremist groups have turned to Twitter, to Facebook, and YouTube to recruit. It's the strength of momentum of ISIS on the ground that allows them to do this, but they're recruiting, they're radicalizing, and they're encouraging attacks on our free society. Social media companies have taken some steps to remove terrorist content, but it is clear that much more needs to be done. The administration must lay out how we will contend with these terrorists hijacking the social network, ironically created by the free and pluralistic society that they so despise for their own twisted purposes. And I want to thank Representative Issa for working with Representative Poe and the committee on changes to strengthen this bill and to allow us to learn more about the ways the U.S. government and the private sector are using social media to push back on extremist messaging. Then we have House Resolution 346, condemning the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And earlier this year, Secretary Kerry testified that the administration had succeeded in getting all the chemical weapons out of Syria. That, unfortunately, as we've had hearings here about the barrel bombs and the chemical weapons that are still being dropped, the first responders are telling us from the front lines in Syria that Assad has been pummeling his own people with an unending series of bombs filled with weaponized chlorine, and this has been confirmed. These attacks fuel the flight of refugees, both inside and outside of Syria, and create an environment in which ISIS can thrive. So members on this committee have long pressed for consideration of a no-fly or safe zone to stop the barrel bombs, the chemical weapon bombs, something this resolution addresses. I want to thank Representative Yoho for his leadership on this critical issue and urge all members to support this resolution. Then we go to the Taiwan Naval Support Act. This is 4154. It's been almost 1 year since the President signed into law the Naval Vessel Transfer Act. That's legislation that I had authored and we pushed through, which authorized the President to transfer decommissioned naval vessels to Taiwan. Since then, the administration has failed to notify Congress of its intent to transfer these vessels, which has caused the U.S. Navy to delay its refurbishment and transfer one of the ships out of Hawaii. This is an unnecessary setback and complicates planning for Taiwan's Navy, as Representative Sherman has pointed out to us. And I want to thank Representative Sherman for introducing this measure today, which will press the administration to submit a timeline to Congress for when these transfers will occur. Ensuring their timely transfer is important to bolstering Taiwan's defense and to ensuring peace in the Taiwan Straits. And turning to the Press Freedom in the Western Hemisphere Act, I think this is a cornerstone of any democracy. It's our obligation to promote and protect this fundamental human right. We have all been troubled by the erosion of press freedoms in our own hemisphere at the hands of authoritarian populist leaders and transnational criminal organizations to boot. So this resolution is an important expression of our support for the fundamental right to free expression and of our belief that regional leaders and the OAS need to do more to condemn what in some parts is the systemic violation of press freedom. So I commend Mr. Series for introducing this resolution, and all who champion freedom of expression as a fundamental part of a vibrant, dramatic tradition, as he says, this resolution will champion their cause. And so, with that said, I'll turn to Mr. Engel, our ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this markup our final full committee markup of 2015. Let me say again how proud I am of the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee and of our members on both sides of the aisle. This year we've racked up an impressive record of achievement, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and your commitment to leaving politics at the water's edge. And I want to also take this opportunity to remind our colleagues on both sides of the aisle that today at 5 o'clock from 5 to 7 in this very room, the Foreign Affairs Committee is having its holiday party, and we hope that every member will attend. There'll be plenty of food, and it'll be another nice chance to get together. So we have a raft of good measures before us today, and I'll say a few words about each. I'll start, Mr. Chairman, with your legislation to provide defense training and equipment directly to the Kurdish regional government. Kurdish forces in northern Iraq have been some of our closest partners in the fight against ISIS. They're tough fighters, getting real results, rolling back the gains ISIS has made. We need to make sure the Kurds have everything they need to defend themselves and keep the pressure on ISIS. They have really been loyal and true allies and friends. Current law requires all military assistance for the Kurds to flow through Baghdad. Now, this has caused some delays in the shipment of arms to Kurdish forces and complicated efforts to supply the Kurds with the heavy weapons they need, including anti-tank missiles, armored vehicles, and long-range artillery. This legislation removes those roadblocks. It would authorize the President to provide military equipment directly to the Iraqi Kurds for a period of 3 years. It urges the President to continue consulting with the Iraqi government, and it requires that the weapons provided to the Kurds be used to meet our shared goal of defeating ISIS. This just makes sense. The Kurds are making progress, and we need to keep the wind at their backs. But while the Kurds are great partners and formidable fighters, they cannot take on ISIS all by themselves, particularly outside of the traditional Kurdish areas of Iraq. At the end of the day, defeating ISIS will take the combined efforts of all Iraqis, and I want to be absolutely clear on this point. While the legislation is focused on supporting the Kurds, it does not in any way dial back America's commitment to other Iraqi partners. It does not endorse a divided Iraq. Rather, it gets military equipment where it will do the most good more quickly, period. In fact, it's imperative that we do keep working closely with Iraq's government. Many of us have serious questions about the performance of the Iraqi army and deep concerns about the role of Iran-backed militias, but it's clear that the Iraqi security forces have a central role to play. On another day, we can talk about the Kurds, because I think the Kurds are a people that deserve international support. And that's another issue to talk about later on, whether or not the Kurds should be trapped in a Iraq that seems continuing to spiral out of control. But right now, it's very important that Iraqi security forces do have a central role to play. We should also support Christians, Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious minorities. Many of these groups have borne the brunt of ISIS terror and now want to help liberate their towns and villages. And finally, we should find new ways to collaborate with the Sunni population of Iraq. The Sunnis will play a vital role defeating ISIS, just as they were key to the defeat of al-Qaeda during the Iraq War. But they need training and equipment, so we need to work with the Iraqi government to get them the support they need and to make clear that they have a stake in the future of a unified Iraq. I know we are all aggravated over the fact that they seem to cut and run and let ISIS take over swaths of territory. Well, instead of just wringing our hands, we really need to do something about it, and this, I believe, will. Next, I'll turn to Mr. Poe and Mr. Sherman's bill to combat the use of social media by terrorist groups. I'm very proud to co-sponsor this legislation. Perhaps the most searing images we've seen of ISIS are of Jihadi John, as he was known, standing over the bodies of his victims, images and videos that ISIS blasted around the world on social media. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about him anymore. But whether on Twitter or YouTube, terrorist groups continue to take full advantage of social media to spread their message of violence and hatred. With the click of a button, groups like ISIS can use these platforms to broadcast video of their heinous acts, solicit foreign fighters, and radicalize vulnerable people around the world. We need a strategy to push back against terrorist use of social media, to foster greater collaboration between government and private sector companies, and to help identify and stop terrorist activities online. This bill calls for that strategy and will help us take on ISIS and other groups on the virtual battlefield. I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Moving on, I'm happy to support this Taiwan Naval Support Act, sponsored by Mr. Sherman, the ranking member of our Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. I'm a strong supporter of Taiwan, and I think Taiwan needs to maintain a strong defense. Nearly a year ago, the Naval Vessel Transfer Act was signed. This bill authorized the sale of 4 guided missile frigates to Taiwan. Taiwan is ready to buy at least 2 of them, and restoration is underway, but Congress has yet to be notified of a transfer. Now, in my view, we should be seeing even more regular transfers of equipment that would help shore up Taiwanese security. I know sales to Taiwan are always a touchy issue because our dealings with China are sensitive. We don't want to derail our work with China on issues of mutual concern, but our desire not to upset Beijing shouldn't come at the expense of Taiwan's security. This bill would require the President to commit to a timeline for these sales and communicate that timeline to Congress. It wouldn't force a deadline, but it would let us know that these sales are on track. We owe at least this much to our friends and partners in Taiwan. I support this legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. I also want to voice my support for Mr. Yoho's resolution condemning the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and I thank him for his work on this measure. 2 years ago, the world was shocked when the Assad regime killed 1,400 of its own people, including hundreds of children in a chemical weapons attack in the outskirts of Damascus. In response to pressure from the international community, including the threat of force from the U.S., the Assad regime agreed to give up all of its chemical weapons and join the Chemical Weapons Convention. But even before I wrote the Syria Accountability Act a decade ago, I never trusted Assad to keep his word. And true to form, he hasn't lived up to the letter or spirit of what he promised to do. Congresswoman Ross Layton partnered with me on the Syria Accountability Act when few knew about Assad, but we knew about Assad, and we knew that Assad was a negative force in the region, to say the least. Many experts believe that Assad failed to declare all of his banned chemical weapons to the international community. And we know for a fact that the regime has increasingly used chlorine as a chemical weapon, which is prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention. This resolution condemns the Assad regime's use of chlorine as a chemical weapon, calls for those involved in this unlawful activity to be held accountable, and urges the administration to support efforts to collect evidence of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And lastly, let me thank Mr. Seres for for offering this resolution supporting press freedom in Latin America and the Caribbean, and condemning violence against journalists. I am deeply troubled that the freedom of the press is under grave threat in some countries right here in our neighborhood. We hear a great deal from regional leaders in the Americas when electoral democracy is at risk, and I appreciate this. Unfortunately, we hear too little about the subtle challenges to democracy, particularly violations of press freedom. When the Ecuadorian government threatened to close down Fundamentos earlier this year, Chairman Royce and I strongly condemned the effort. Fortunately, President Correa relented in the face of international condemnation. But this is just one example. Violence against journalists has become a scourge in the Americas. Being a journalist in Colombia, Mexico, and Honduras is a very dangerous business. Of course, there is no press freedom in Cuba. Venezuela is also a worry and a country that represses freedom, although the election held there a few days ago gives us pause for hope. This resolution shines a light on the problem and urges these governments to do more to provide protection to those journalists under threat, and I'm pleased to support it. So once again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership and for bringing all these measures forward today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We now go to Ileana Ross-Lehtinen and any other members who are seeking recognition. But Ileana Ross-Lehtinen from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel, for convening this markup and bringing up all of these important measures in front of our committee in a bipartisan manner, as you always do. I would also like to express my strong support for House Resolution 536, introduced by my dear friend Albio Ceres, of which I am the lead Republican sponsor. Freedom of expression is under attack in Latin America. We've seen it in Venezuela, where the Maduro regime has used intimidation and control of the media to repress the opposition. Courageously, the opposition was able to beat the odds and took control of the legislature by a supermajority just this past weekend. I congratulate the Venezuelan people on their tremendous win, but there's still a long road ahead. We need all political prisoners to be released immediately, including pro-democracy advocate Leopoldo Lopez. In Nicaragua, Ortega just forced through a new sovereignty security law that could be used to further harass and intimidate the people and the media to impede freedom of expression. I worry that Ortega will use this as yet another tool to clamp down on civil society, silence the media as we approach next year's presidential election. In Cuba, as both of you have pointed out, the Castro regime continues to control all print and broadcast media and blocks and censors the internet. The regime also threatens, beats, jails, and tortures any perceived opposition, intimidating the Cuban people into self-censorship. Cuba has long been infamous for these tactics, but we also see it in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, many like-minded dictatorships in Latin America, regimes that want to control the flow of information to stay in power, repress any dissent, before their survival is threatened, employ these tactics. It's crucial that we as a country continue to speak out against these tactics and that we do everything that we can to stand up for this fundamental human right to express freely one's views. I thank Albio for offering his important resolution. I offer my full support and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I also want to thank my friend and colleague from Florida, Dr. Ted Yoho, for introducing House Resolution 346, condemning Assad for committing mass atrocities and for the use of chemical weapons, including chlorine barrel bombs. I was an original co-sponsor of this measure, and I fully support it. This important resolution reminds us all of the grim reality and the true nature of the Assad regime. The idea that Assad should be part of a political solution or that he can be a partner in the war against ISIS and the war against terror is appalling. Assad's ruthless tactics and wanton disregard for human rights and the sanctity of life has been a key reason why the Syrian conflict has been so devastating and why ISIS has grown dramatically. Assad's actions have led to the deaths of over 220,000 Syrians. Because of Assad, we have millions of refugees fleeing into the Middle East and Europe, destabilizing these regions and taxing their resources. In July, the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that the Assad regime did not give up all of its chemical weapons, and now some reports suggest that ISIS may be in possession of chemical weapons as well. And what has been the punishment from the international community for Assad's deception? Nothing. So if the international community is not willing to punish Assad for using chemical weapons and then lying about destroying all of its stockpiles, what faith do we have in keeping the Iranian regime accountable for its nuclear weapons program? This is a very dangerous situation, Mr. Chairman, and I believe that it is not receiving the attention it merits. So that's why I thank my Florida colleague, Dr. Yoho, for bringing this bipartisan resolution forward. I urge my colleagues to support this measure and condemn the use of chemical weapons. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.
Thank you, Eliana. We now go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're considering 5 excellent bills here today. They're common sense, they're bipartisan, and that reflects the leadership that the chair and the ranking member have brought to this committee. I'll address 3 of those bills. First, the Taiwan Naval Support Act. I want to thank the chairman for bringing up this bill, which we put together with a lot of input from others. And I want to thank the chairman, ranking member, and Mr. Salmon, the ranking member of the chairman of the ranking, the chairman of the Asia Subcommittee, for co-sponsoring the bill. When we look at the East and South China Sea, we see China becoming more aggressive. Already, we are spending tens or hundreds of billions of dollars on research, procurement, planning, and deployment designed to confront China. That invariably creates risks for the United States, and most of that is focused on uninhabited islets. In contrast, look at Taiwan. What is at stake is not uninhabited reefs, but the entire country. And Taiwan is not asking us for a deployment or to spend money. They are simply asking for the tools to defend themselves. When it comes to these frigates, the time has come to transfer the frigates. We should be helping Taiwan defend itself.
Is that a technical term, Mr. Sherman?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it's in the statute with a page and a half of definition. Yes. When it comes to helping Taiwan defend itself, I think it should be classified as a major non-NATO ally, and I offered an amendment back 15 years ago to do just that. If that had passed, we wouldn't even need, I think, to prod the administration as we do now. In 1979, the Taiwan Relations Act was signed into law, and it requires the United States to make available to Taiwan such defense articles as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain sufficient defense capacities, self-defense capacities. In December of 2014, this Congress passed the Naval Vessel Transfer Act and authorized the sale of 4 frigates to Taiwan. And the President signed that bill into law. Taiwan has indicated it's ready to purchase 2 frigates out of the 4. It has the money to do so. It faces a budgetary deadline at the end of 2015. And it's time for the administration to move forward with this transfer. What this bill does is requires the administration to give Congress a timeline. I hope they transfer the frigates before they give us the timeline. That would be a very good timeline. Next, I'm pleased to join with Mr. Poe as the lead Democratic sponsor of the Combat Terrorist Use of Social Media Act. 3 things about the bill. The State Department's current strategy for countering ISIS and other extremist groups online is obviously not working. That's not my opinion. That's the State Department's internal opinion, which concluded in June of this year. When it comes to the external message, our narrative is being trumped by ISIS. We are losing a popularity contest to people that behead women. Public information also shows the State Department strategy isn't working. The Think Again, Turn Away Twitter campaign has 24,000 followers. In order to reach out to those who might be swayed by ISIS, you're going to need a much bigger following. This bill requires the State Department to reassess their approach and come up with a better, more effective strategy. Second, I'm hoping that this bill will prod the State Department to hire experts in Islamic theology and in Islamic jurisprudence. Not everybody they hire has to be a graduate of an Ivy League school or a top American school. We need just a couple of folks over there, graduates of Al-Azhar University in Egypt. I'm not saying the State Department can issue a fatwa, but somebody at the State Department should be paid because they're an expert at knowing who should be issuing a fatwa and how to make our arguments consistent with all of the intricacies of Islamic law and Islamic jurisprudence. Finally, the social media companies have played a role in this. I believe Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter have a responsibility to make sure that their platforms are not used by terrorists. Facebook, YouTube, and with some prodding from members of this committee, Twitter, have made changes to take down bad content. But that won't work effectively if the State Department isn't identifying the bad content. The only thing worse than playing whack-a-mole is to not whack the moles. And every time one of these terrorist sites pops up, we should see it before the intended audience and have it taken down before the intended audience. So I look forward to the passage of that legislation and to a much better strategy from the State Department. Finally, as far as arming the Kurdish regional government, it's about time. We wouldn't have to do it if Baghdad had been reasonable, but if the Baghdad government had been reasonable, we wouldn't even have ISIS to begin with. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, I appreciate your leadership on these issues that are of vital importance to the security of our country and the peace of the world. Number one, obviously, we need to move forward as quickly as possible. It's long overdue of helping our friends, the Kurds, who are bearing the brunt of this whole battle against radical Islam in that part of the world at this time. Certainly, we need to combat terrorist use of the social media, and certainly our friends in Taiwan, if they have the money and they want to buy our friggin' frigates, we should be able to make sure we provide it for them. And of course, supporting press freedom in Latin America is vitally important because you have forces at play and that can be combated with an informational combat rather than physical combat. We should be part of that competition. But let me note then to this condemnation of toxic chemicals by the Syrian regime. There's no doubt the Syrian regime is a murderous regime. It's a brutal regime. They're tyrannical. They're corrupt, blah, blah, blah. The Assad regime is the last Ba'athist regime of the region. But let us be honest about what's going on here. There is an uprising going on in Syria. I will tell you, I don't know any of the regimes in that part of the world that would not be as murderous and as brutal in suppressing. They might not use chemical weapons, but they will kill as many civilians as they need to maintain their power. In that part of the world, an uprising against a regime is the equivalent of World War II to them. They know if they lose everything. Now, I'm not excusing the use of chemical weapons or the killing of civilians, but remember, collateral damage is what we're talking about here. And we ourselves understand a certain level of collateral damage when you are at war. The Assad regime, which is a tyrannical regime, like our other allies in that region, know that if they lose an uprising, they will be killed. And, Yes, we hope that collateral damage in our own troops is kept to a minimum. But we also know that during World War II, when we were threatened, we carpet bombed the cities of Germany and Japan. We incinerated tens of thousands of civilians in order to end that war. And we did that. And that's so. Number two, I would hope that we understand that we're not going to be hypocritical here by claiming that Assad is so bad as compared to everybody else. He's not. He is tyrannical, he's horrible, but he is no different in terms of the brutality that he would rain upon his people as any other regime that is allied with us in that region. And finally, let me just note that I disagree with my good friend Ileana Ros-Lehtinen on the point that Assad is causing these all of these people to flee. It's not Assad that's causing. It's ISIL. It's you have a new force moving across that part of the world, and without them, and I believe that even without Assad in there, that force in that part of the world would be creating this refugee flow from throughout, and from Libya, from Africa, and from that part of the world. So I would have to say that, and one last note on this condemnation of toxic chemicals, it also says we should be open to the idea of a no-fly zone. What you're saying there is, yes, we should be open to the idea that American airplanes will shoot down Russian airplanes, Russian military aircraft. I think that we need to do a lot of thinking before we approve anything like that, although the actual resolution just says we should be looking at alternatives, including that. But do we really want to have send American airplanes there to do combat with Russian military aircraft in order to bring Assad down, in order to create a more benevolent regime, which may end up being immediately overthrown, like what happened with Gaddafi, by radical Islamic forces? This is a very complex area, and it's a complex fight. Let's make sure that we're being honest with ourselves in our analysis of what's going on. And thank you very much. I will be voting with you, Mr. Chairman, if these are in block. But I've stated my objections, and I certainly support everything and all the rest of the amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Now we go to Mr. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and the staff for their support on promoting democratic values around the world and their efforts to mark up this bill. I want to thank my good friend Ileana Ros-Lehtinen for serving as the Republican lead on this legislation, and my colleague, Chairman Jeff Duncan, for his leadership on this issue. Freedom of expression is the cornerstone of any democratic nation. It is the #1 tool to hold people and governments accountable for their actions. In recent years, many organizations dedicated to freedom of speech and advancing civil societies have been trying to bring attention to the deterioration of press freedom in parts of the Western Hemisphere, specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba has consistently been characterized as having one of the most repressive media environments in the world, with the Castro regime controlling all aspects of the print and electronic media. Venezuela and Ecuador have harassed and fined the media, shut down the operations, and even physically attacked journalists who are trying to expose the state-sponsored crackdown against peaceful political dissenters. In other countries, such as Mexico and Honduras, an increase in drug-related violence and worsening security situations have created a culture of impunity, allowing violence against journalists and press institutions to go unpunished. As a child in Cuba, I witnessed the deterioration of democracy as the Castro regime took over the island and systematically destroyed all aspects of freedom of speech and expression. There is a strong connection between countries' democratic values and the freedom afforded to their press. Working to preserve freedom of speech and pushing back against those who seek to quiet their dissenters should be a top priority when engaging our neighbors in the region. That is why I introduced H.R. 536, a resolution condemning violations of press freedom and violence against journalists, bloggers, and individuals exercising their right to freedom of speech. This resolution condemns these violations and urges countries in the region to implement the recommendations of member states made by the Organization of American States Office of Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and urges our administration to assist the media in closed societies to promote free press. I thank the committee for their time, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 536.
Thank you, Mr. Series. We now go to Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ohio.
I will be brief. I support all the resolutions. I'll just comment on two of them. One, I certainly support the, with respect to Kurdistan. I think it's embarrassing how long it's taken the administration basically to arm those people that have been willing to stand up to these murderous miscreants of ISIS. And it reminds me a bit of Ukraine, where we've been embarrassingly delayed in helping those people who need help in standing up to Putin's bullies over there. And relative to Mr. Sherman's frigates bill, I totally support him there. I was one of the founding members of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, and it's ridiculous how long it's taken to get this to happen. And following pretty closely what's going on in Taiwan, there's a lot of speculation there that the most recent delay has been related to the administration's not wanting to offend or upset President Xi of China, who the Obama administration has believed that they need the support and the assistance and the cooperation in their global warming / climate change conference in Paris. And of course, they were, very quick to announce the cooperation that we have with China, everything down the road, nothing up front. We're supposed to do this stuff up front, which is going to affect our economy, and if passed, which it won't, but if it did pass, would kill an awful lot of jobs here in the United States. But they push this stuff, they work with Xi. It looks like we're cooperating, but everything China does is way out in the future. Everything we do would be now. But a lot of speculation in Taiwan that that's what the most recent delay on these frigates is. They didn't want to upset President Xi. But I commend Mr. Sherman for pushing this, and will support all these measures. I yield back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I support all 5 bills in front of us today and commend both the chairman and ranking member and their respective staffs for bringing bipartisan legislation before us. 2 I'd like to just highlight briefly. One is H.R. 1654, authorizing the direct provision of defense articles to the Kurds, to the Kurdistan Regional Government. We need to do this. The only thing succeeding on the ground in that region that we've invested in is the Peshmerga. They're willing to fight, and they've got successes. And we ought to be supportive of them as robustly as we possibly can. And that's why this bill, I think, is so important. Whatever reluctance there's been in the past about, well, we got to go through the central government in Baghdad and so forth, we can't afford to do that. They're effective. They're willing to fight. They're willing to take the risk. All they need is our assistance. And I think we need to provide it, and I'm happy to support this bill. And the second bill I want to highlight is, as the co-chair of the Taiwan Caucus, I agree with the sentiments that have been expressed with respect to H.R. 4154, the Taiwan Naval Support Act. This is about us keeping our commitment pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act. It's not about tweaking somebody else or trying to provoke. It's about keeping our commitment so that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself. And this is a modest effort, and it's been going on, as Mr. Shabbat said, way too long. And I might add, the reluctance to provoke Beijing is a bipartisan reluctance in terms of White Houses. It's time we move on. Beijing needs to understand we're going to keep our commitment with respect to the Taiwan Relations Act. This is not aimed at them. It's not to provoke them. But we have a commitment, a statutory commitment, and we're going to keep it. And we're only talking about 4 frigates. of the Oliver Hazard Perry class, hardly something that's a threat to somebody else in the region, but definitely designed to help a country or a nation defend itself. And that's all we're doing here. I support the legislation as long overdue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Judge Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair, ranking member, and especially my friend, Mr. Connolly from Virginia, for helping get the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act to the House floor last night. Passed the House by voice vote unanimously, and hopefully the Senate will take this bill up. As the chair knows, this bill passed the House 4 years ago in December, and the Senate blocked it, so maybe we can get some accountability with the State Department and Foreign Affairs. I want to echo also what Mr. Connolly mentioned about the Kurds. It's ironic that when ISIS first started and their battle with the Iraqi troops cut and ran, left American equipment on the battlefield. ISIS took that equipment, including tanks and trucks and every type of weapon you can come up with. It seems only fair that we get the same kind of equipment to the Kurds, who are now fighting ISIS, with the equipment that we sent the Kurds who left it there on the battlefield. So I think that I support this bill with helping out the Kurds. The bill I really want to talk most about is the bill that my friend Mr. Sherman and I are co-sponsoring, and that's the social media bill. Terrorist organizations have used social media, and it's exploded over the last few years. A recent Brookings Institute found ISIS has 40,000 Twitter accounts, and they use these accounts for not only propaganda, not only to recruit, but also to raise money for their terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda affiliate Al-Shabaab live tweeted its attack on Kenyan Mall that killed 72 people. The recipes for bombs used in the Boston Marathon attacks were published in Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine online. Al-Qaeda branch in Yemen, known as AQAP, held a press conference on Twitter, allowing users to submit questions that were answered by a terror group and posted back on Twitter the following week. In October, ISIS issued a new instruction manual on how terrorists can use social media. So they can pull up the instruction manual on social media and read about how to use social media to further their activities. There are between 27 and 31,000 foreign fighters in foreign countries, 86 countries. That's double the number from last year. The FBI says that instead of terrorists now having to go to Syria or Iraq to train, all they have to do is log on and get online training. That is quite disturbing. Since March of 2014, 71 people in the United States have been charged with crimes related to ISIS. They don't fit any ethnic profile. There's a trio of teenager siblings from Chicago, former Air Force mechanic in his late 40s from New Jersey, and a mother of two from Philadelphia. But nearly all of them had spent hours online voicing their support for ISIS, and later were arrested on their online posts after that drew the attention to the FBI. The federal government does not have a strategy to counter this problem of online radicalization. In 2011, the administration acknowledged terrorist use of social media and promised a strategy to prevent online radicalization. We don't have that strategy. This legislation says, let's come up with a strategy to prevent terrorist groups, foreign terrorist groups using social media. Facebook and YouTube have done a pretty good job of bringing down these sites. Twitter has not. This bill, H. 3654, to combat terrorist use of social media, requires the President to come up with a strategy. A suggested protocol would be the same strategy that social media companies use to bring down child pornography sites. They have a strategy, a protocol that works to bring down these sites. It would seem to me they could use the same strategy, the same protocol to bring down these terrorist sites. And just to be clear, a foreign terrorist organization does not have a constitutional right under the First Amendment. That's already been ruled on Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project in 2010. If it's a foreign terrorist organization, the Constitution doesn't protect those foreign terrorist organizations from using social media to radicalize, to preach their propaganda, and to raise money. And I support this bill. Thanks again, Mr. Sherman, and I support all the other bills as well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Poe, Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the ranking member and all my colleagues who've brought these good bills and resolutions, which I will support. And I want to add my voice to my colleagues who have pretty much said what I feel about Bashar al-Assad, which he is a scourge to humanity. And to me, it doesn't matter whether there's anyone better or worse than him. He needs to be condemned for what he's doing. But moving on, I wanted to make a comment. You know, yesterday, one of the presidential candidates, whose name I will not promote, he called on our country as a way to combating terrorism to ban Muslims from entering the country. Not only were his remarks unfair and prejudicial and contrary to our American values and way of life, those remarks were dangerous, they were inflammatory, they served to further pit the United States against the Muslim world at a time when we need allies in that arena who will fight with us and join with us to destroy the terrorists that would take away our lives and our way of life. And that's why I am very proud to be here today, Mr. Chair, with my colleagues, because we are showing our constituents and the American people that there are sensible efforts that we can make to combat terrorism while maintaining our respect, our dignity, our American values. And I'm honored to support these efforts today. And I yield back.
Thank you, Lois Frankel. We now go to Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to align myself with the comments of Judge Poe from Texas on H.R. 1654, arming the Kurds. And I would encourage anyone that hasn't traveled to Erbil to meet with the Kurdish leaders and understand these noble people. I would encourage that because we need to arm them. They've been a strong ally in the region. I also want to align myself with the comments that Judge Poe made on 3654 about the use of social media, and I'm glad we're taking that bill up in this particular committee hearing markup. As co-sponsor of H.R. 536 with Congressman Sires, I want to raise my voice in support of it and thank the ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee for his efforts and passion on the issue of press freedoms in the Americas. The ability to speak openly without censure or fear of reprisal is a hallmark of free peoples everywhere, and the freedom of the press is critical to sustaining democracy and the rule of law. In July, the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee held a hearing to examine the threats to press freedoms in the Americas, and we heard testimony of severe government repression and outright targeting of journalists by Cuba, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and the terrible impact to journalists from organized crime, corruption, and impunity in other countries in the region. According to Reporters Without Borders' 2015 World Press Freedom Index, only 3 countries in the Western Hemisphere managed to score in the top 20 of 180 countries documented, and those were Canada, Jamaica, and Costa Rica. Notoriously, Mexico and Cuba were among the worst offenders in the Western Hemisphere listed in that report. In addition, these countries, Ecuador, Honduras, and Peru, all received the worst press freedom scores in over a decade from Freedom House. So all in all, it's important for the United States to promote freedom of the press, and this resolution is an important step in doing that. I fully support it as chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and with that, I yield back.
We'll go now to Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, and I too echo the sentiments that these are 5 very good pieces of legislation before us today, and like to quickly address 3 of them. The first one is H.R. 1654 with respect to arming the Kurds. What I appreciate most about this piece of legislation is that it represents the United States Congress taking an active role in shaping our policy in the war on terror and the war against ISIS. For too long, I think this Congress has been both a spectator and a Monday morning quarterback when it comes to dealing with the war on terror. We have to take action. we have to eventually pass another AUMF for the President. So thank you, Chairman, for bringing this piece of legislation forward. The second one is that by Chairman Poe, H.R. 3654 to combat terrorist use of social media. We understand that there are many components to the war on terror, but to really win this war, we have to stop these folks from communicating their message and inspiring people to commit heinous acts in the United States and other parts of the world. It's important that our social media companies partner with us in that endeavor. So thank you to Chairman Poe for that. And then finally, HRES 536, supporting press freedom in Latin America. Thank you to my colleague Albio Cetas for that. When you think about what's going on in places like Cuba, 31 journalists detained in 2014, in Venezuela with the rough few years that they've had under President Maduro, and also in Mexico where dozens of journalists have been hurt, injured, or killed, not only sometimes by the government there or governments, whether it's the federal government or local governments, but also by those involved in the drug trade. So this is not just an issue of protecting the press from state action or government action, but also asking the governments in these countries to make sure that journalists are being protected from private actors, from criminals. And so, Albio, thank you for this piece of legislation. I yield back.
Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute that updates the numbers of the Syrian death and refugees as well as a few other points to H Resolution 346. This resolution is extremely important as it condemns the Assad regime for the atrocities against the Syrian people despite the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2209. Including the use of barrel bombs, which are made up of liquid chlorine as a weapon, placed in 55-gallon drums filled with shrapnel, TNT, and dropped in residential neighborhoods at night on their own people. The civil war in Syria has been raging for over 4 years, resulting in over 250,000 deaths, 6.5 million internally displaced refugees. At least 4 million people have fled that country. This has led to the largest displacement of people since World War II, creating a refugee crisis not just seen in Syria and the Middle East, but in the world. This has facilitated ISIS's growing strength in terrorist activity. As recently as last June, Samantha Power testified before this committee that there are serious and alarming reports that Assad has been turning chlorine into a chemical weapon via the barrel bombs. This resolution condemns this abhorrent behavior and urges the United States and her allies and partners to seek a comprehensive strategy in Syria. If we are serious about bringing this civil war to an end, I urge unanimous support for this large bipartisan supported resolution. For a period of 4 years is way too long for there not to be a plan to stop this atrocity. And again, thanks again to Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Eddie Acevedo, Tom Sheehy, and on the Foreign Affairs Committee, their staff, and our team, Jimmy Walsh, and all who have helped with this resolution, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Do any other members seek recognition? Hearing no further requests, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. And without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended, and staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. And also without objection, the Chair is authorized to seek House consideration of these measures under suspension of the rules. And that concludes our business for today. I want to thank Ranking Member Engel and all our committee members for their contributions and all of their assistance with today's markup. The committee is... Oh, and Mr. Engel is right to remind everyone that at 5 o'clock this evening, the committee will re-adjourn here for the holiday. Okay? All right. Until then, we stand adjourned.